Welcome. It's April 17th, 2015, and this is the Unseen Podcast, episode number 3. My name is Paul Carr. The Unseen Podcast is the unscripted, unedited, Creative Commons, and open participation spinoff of the Wow Signal. To learn more about the Wow Signal, go to wowsignalpodcast.com. If you want to be in the panel pool for the Unseen Podcast, email me at unseenpodcast@gmail.com and I'll let you know how you can join. You can also go to unseenpodcast.com for more information. And by the way, we now have our own Twitter feed at Unseen Podcast. So join us there as well. Now tonight, the subject is going to be the human relationship to artificial intelligence and what the future bodes. And you might notice that this kind of bears a relationship to a Wow Signal episode we did last year with Robin Hanson, in which we talked about what happens when artificial and general intelligence takes over our jobs. So we'll get into that in just a moment. First, I would like to make a brief correction from last week. I did mention that last week I thought the Topaz reactor had crashed in the Canadian Arctic and made a big mess. It turned out it was not the Topaz. It was a different reactor. If you're an authority on Soviet nuclear space or what happened then, I would love to hear from you, and you can straighten me out even further on that. So anyway, let's get started. Tonight we have with us Buck Field. Buck, who is Buck Field?
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me on. Buck Field is a project manager who's made a career in information systems development and research. And my primary focus right now is in philosophy of science and research into what makes science special, particularly the structures and methods of developing transformative ideas or scientific revolutions.
Great. And Buck, we'll definitely have to have an episode just on the philosophy of science. That's a field that fascinates me as well. And we also have tonight Chris MacGinlay, who is in the United Kingdom, and it's 1:30 there. Chris MacGinlay. Who is Chris MacGinlay?
Hi, Paul. Thanks for inviting me onto the show. I'm UK-based, as you've mentioned. I'm a UK-based secondary school teacher. I've been teaching physics for 20 years, mostly at junior high school level. I've taught a bit of maths and also some computing in that time as well. And in my spare time, when I'm not in my day job, I enjoy software development, for which I use Python and Django quite a lot. I also dabble with microcontrollers such as the Arduino platform. But for a complete change of scenery, then I really quite enjoy boating. I enjoy kind of any walking or outdoor pursuits, to be absolutely honest. Just anything to get outside and enjoy the fresh air.
Yeah. Now, Chris, you and I are going to have to talk about Arduino and Python sometime, but not tonight.
Okay. Yeah, there's quite a lot to talk about tonight.
Yeah. Tonight, the subject, as I mentioned, is we're starting to make contact with this strange thing called artificial intelligence. It seems that train has left the station. What we call narrow AI, which is artificial intelligence that addresses a very specific domain, is doing very well. Probably the best example in the news right now is self-driving cars. That has been going on for many years now, and we're getting to the point where those of us who have children who are entering their teen years are hoping fervently that self-driving cars become available soon. there are other many examples of narrow AI, including the when you call up a service on the telephone and it asks you to tell it what you're calling about. That's actually AI going on under the hood there. And we can probably come up with a number of other examples. But one thing we want to talk about tonight was the emergence of something called artificial general intelligence, which is something that is potentially a lot more powerful than narrow AI, something that could, in fact, not only optimize the connections on a microchip, but actually design the microchip from top-level specifications. And in fact, AI that could design itself and program itself. When we get to that point, we've reached a point where we kind of question whether or not the human being is even part of the process anymore. So the first thing that raises in my mind is something called robot ethics or AI ethics. That is, is it possible for us now, before things get out of control, to build in to our robots a sense of right and wrong that would result in a lack of harm to humans? Now, there was a guy who was a big influence on me, and I think many other people about my age, named Isaac Asimov. Asimov was a prolific writer. He was famous for both his science fiction and his nonfiction. He typically had about 5 books going at once, and he was a big influence on a lot of people. Asimov put forth something called the 3 laws of robotics. Now, I'm going to briefly go over back over what those are, and I want to ask the question: is that a good starting point for robot ethics? And if not, is there any hope for robot ethics? So let's start with what Asimov stated. And Asimov wrote a lot of stories, and each story he would sort of challenge one of the laws of robotics and see what happened. So the first law is robots may not harm humans or allow harm to come to humans through their inaction. The second law is that robots must obey humans unless it violates the first law. And the third law is a robot will protect itself from harm except that it violates Rule 2 or Rule 1. So that's been the focus of a lot of people's thinking about how robots should behave. Now, what do you guys think? Is that a good starting point, or should we? Is any of it something we can keep, or do we have to throw it out and start over?
I think number 2, if I might just start off thinking about number 2, which might have a bit of a problem in obeying humans, that if, for example, if I have a robot and I command my robot to do something which benefits me, but then causes quite a lot of damage to the environment because there's no provision for protection for any kind of environmental considerations there. And that, I don't think that would be desirable, because if I had a powerful robot, I could set it to do tasks that might make me wealthy in some way, but might cause quite a lot of destruction and damage in its wake, and that's not covered.
Well, now with that, could we subsume that under the heading of risk to other humans, though? I mean, if I pollute the stream that your water comes from, I'm harming you, right?
Not necessarily.
Yeah, not necessarily. I think there are circumstances where you could do environmental damage that wouldn't really harm any humans directly, although obviously with the planet being one.
But part of this question, and I think that's a great exception that Chris puts forward, is one of the key attributes of intelligence itself is imagination. And for example, if you want to go from a worldview where to get from point A to point B, you have to walk toward the mountain where the sun rises for the length of time that it takes you to sing a particular song, and then turn left at a particular tree and whatnot. That's a very complicated set of rules. If you can imagine the Earth as being flat, it gives you the capability, and we like to make fun of flat earthers, but if you can imagine that the Earth is actually flat, then it gives you the capability to use a map and say, you know what, we don't have to have a long story about how to get from here to there. We can draw a little schematic in the mud and use that. The flat Earth model, far from being only a representation of backward thinking, this was actually a revolutionary advance in human cognition. And when machines can make that type of jump from, it's kind of a leap of the imagination, which we don't understand very well, other than to say, there's certain things we do know about it. We know that it makes use of analogy. We know that it makes use of, well, in humans anyway, it makes use of cultural artifacts around us. But transformative imagination like that would enable a machine to say, well, environmental harm, should be considered in this thing that you're asking me to do. And oh, by the way, we don't want to do that because if I dig a latrine out in the back a certain way, it's going to kill the neighbor's kids through dysentery. We want an android to be able to recognize this. That's a non-trivial problem.
True, it is. It is non-trivial. But in all these laws of Asimov, there's kind of the built-in assumption that the robot can assess the consequences, at least locally, of its actions. But I think what Chris is saying is maybe more global consequences are harder to assess. Is that, or did I miss
Not necessarily global consequences. It could be, but it could also simply be a localized consideration of non-human impacts. It could even consider impacts on animals or plants living in an area.
Right. Well, so let's say
right to life anyway.
There's no let's say, for example, the robot knows that a particular action will increase its CO2 emissions.
I was just thinking of that might be a good criteria that you would want to incorporate in its evaluation of scoping, right, in terms of what are the physical inputs that are coming from this? Is there any identified harm with obtaining the inputs necessary for following this direction? And then the outputs from it, what have been the potential risks? And you could kind of do like a little spider search through, well, what has been problems in the past for this type of operation affecting the environment? I'm curious, Chris, when you say do something, did you have a particular use case in mind? Like you ask your robot to do something or you ask your android to do something?
No, I didn't, but just as I've been talking about it, I had a sort of the crazy notion. Suppose that somebody tells their robot to set a fire, set a bushfire just for devilment, and because somebody might do that.
Mm-hmm.
Bit of vandalism and people do reckless things like that.
And it would need to know the difference between a campfire and a wildfire.
Yeah, would the robot be able to say, well, I'm not doing that, because that's clearly a bad idea. So no, I didn't really have a use case. I think there's several like that would be situations where a person might ask a robot to do something that other people wouldn't necessarily harm a human, but other humans would view in a negative way and think was a poor choice. I'm sure
that we could, in the case of fire activities or whatnot, I'm sure that that those kind of limits and risks could be identified pretty quickly if you set that as a goal.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, are we considering, I don't think this affects the central question of whether or not these laws are good laws or not, but are we thinking here of a robot or an artificial intelligence acting on its own, which to my mind seems more likely that it would be part of a connected system, and a device on the ground may be communicating with a system like IBM's Watson or something like that, which is located elsewhere, and may have access to that for further advice. I don't think that changes the fundamental question of whether these laws are a good starting point or not, but it does change the mechanics of how that decision-taking process.
Yeah, well,
I would say no artificial person is an island.
Right. Well, I mean, Rule 2 says obey humans, but it doesn't say which humans, right? If humans are at odds with each other.
That's true.
That's another problem that I have with it, although Asimov did address that in some of his stories. My memory's failing me on which ones, but now I think the reason you need 2 is because Rule 3 by itself prohibits the robot from going into accepting dangerous environments. For example, if we send a robot into the Fukushima reactor area where it's going to probably take some damage, it's protecting its own existence. It would refuse to do that, but Law 2 says no. You have to do it. You have to obey the human that sends you into the high radiation area, and so I mean I can understand where Asimov was coming from in setting up Rule 2. And I think he kind of assumed that all humans are not at odds with each other in commanding a given robot, but that could be.
Well, I think it's very easy to add on the list. We have Asimov's Rule 1 point, 2 point, 3 point, and I have no problem with a 1.1, 2.2. So under 2.2, obey humans means a hierarchy. So like if a child tells you to do something, you may not, you may need to get approval for making a martini from the adult.
Right. But we're assuming a robust and well-educated assessment of what is harm to humans, right? But
there was one of the stories which one of the robots actually introduced another law. So it wasn't a 1.1 or a 2.1, it was a 0. And I believe the robot was called Giscard. It was one of the Foundation series. It might have been Giscard or a robot called Oliver. And I think the law that it came up with after some significant problems was Law 0, to protect humanity.
Humanity, basically. Right. Yeah. He did add a Law 0, yes.
If we're talking about environmental considerations, from our discussion on point number 2 there, maybe humanity isn't really what the Law 0 would be. If it was up to me, I think it would be more the biome or something like that. Protect the biosphere, protect the biome, not just the humans. It's a bit of a human-centric view of the world.
Yes.
Possibly.
Well, Yeah, and of course, humanity can be interpreted very broadly, and something that Asimov did address was, at what point do robots themselves become humanity? Do they become human-like enough to that they have human rights and deserve to be protected? And that's not an easy line to draw. And I'm sure you're familiar with Bicentennial Man or some of the other fiction that's been done on that. Of course, the android Data in Star Trek, right? He was so close to human that he almost had human rights and human. He didn't quite have human emotion, but he wanted that. Although,
well, he got an emotion chip eventually.
Yeah, he did eventually get emotion. Yeah, he did. Now,
as for the zeroth law, I just wanted to say I just that's actually in Wikipedia, and it was the detective Daniel J. Oliva. He first said it in Robots and Empire, but according to Wikipedia, Susan Calvin states the concept in the short story "The Inevitable Conflict."
Okay, good. You know what? I need to reread all this stuff.
I was just thinking the same thing because I really enjoyed reading those the first time that I had.
Yeah, I read all that when I was a kid. I didn't let any robot novel or robot short story collection go by me. But let's see. Now, one problem that I have is, let's say we've decided that the 3 laws of robotics were a good idea, or some variation on that. The problem with Law 1 is we've already kind of broken it, right? We're already using narrow AI in war. So we're already harming humans with robots. So is that possible to even rein that in?
No.
Probably not. I would agree. It's cat's out of the bag.
The problem is, in war, there basically aren't any rules. Nobody believes it. The people that think that a fight is unfair are the people that lose it. Right? The people that win the fight don't think it's unfair. The rules are meant to be broken there. So the problem is that as long as war is a driver, I don't see that we'll ever get to that. And
no. In fact, it's not even a question of getting to it. It's we will go the other way. We will artificially evolve faster than has ever happened. The most perfect and unconstrained predators, assuming we survive long enough to do that. The trend lines are not good on human survival.
Well, okay. So is it possible to bring any kind of rule into as AGI starts to evolve? And it's not there yet. I think there are a lot of people who are AGI skeptics who think AGI is very far away. Others think it's close. Some people say just the raw speed and storage capability of computers as it evolves will make it happen. Others say it will happen. It'll evolve out of the out of the digital universe, and it won't even be something humans control or design. Others say that we will design it. I guess if we are designing it, and let's say we decide that we don't want it to destroy us, is there any sort of robot ethics that could be useful, or could be agreed upon, could be universally adopted?
I think one of the questions that one needs to ask is, how would you actually implement a system of ethics, the ethical laws of robotics, and what mechanism would you use to give those to the device in a situation where, it's really quite easy for people to construct robots. It's not difficult. It's the nature of it. It's very hard to put in place something where you're going to prevent people from doing something that steps outside of your laws. So I think that's a problem straight away. Even if you can come up with some laws, then the actual practicalities of implementing that's going to be hard. I think maybe legally you could have an international law that you could be broken by people that were designing killer robots and so on. You could do it that way, and then you could prosecute individuals and so on.
Almost anything that gets designed under international law, there's going to be international criminals that try to break it, right? Or actually succeed in breaking it and make a profit from it.
And how are you going to prosecute, if someone has overwhelming, military force and the concomitant, the indemnity from, international law that would enable that. My view on your question is that the answer is sort of all of the above. There will be artificial intelligence designed for predatory behavior, as there is already, and there will be others that are designed to sustain people who are the most vulnerable or at the greatest risk. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I think we're going to have to adapt to and learn how to balance.
Right. Well,
I don't want to have an artificial intelligence driven mechanoid come up to me and say, I know that you have this self-preservation instinct, but your amino acids are absolutely vital to this project that regrettably your neocortex is not capable of understanding. But we can make 6.375 times better use of your amino acids by melting you down. So I understand that this is an unpleasant prospect for you, but there it is. And then it tosses me in the vat.
Well,
that's possible, but then you might also consider that if what you're describing sounds like an AGI, if a machine which is an AGI can exist, it might be that it would develop a system of ethics for some reason similar to ours, because most of us would not treat a living creature with such a low level of regard. Most of us, for some reason, view living creatures with a degree of respect.
Right. Well, I mean, the question is, would that system of ethics be at all consistent with human flourishing?
Well, I guess what I'm sort of asking is, would a machine or an entity which has an AGI style of development, would such an entity inevitably have ethics or not? And why do we have ethics? We have ethics in order that we can function as part of a society, as part of a group of people.
Right. I mean,
I would dispute that. I would say that we have evolved ethics because they are good for our survival. We are pro-social creatures. Empathy, and as well as the ability to go to war and murder other members of our own species, is what has survived and replicated. It's a way that a particular kind of DNA strand has survived, just like a blue whale is a way that a certain kind of DNA strand has survived. We like to think of ourselves as being rational or empathetic or these other noble ideals. But I think that that's maybe a bit of hubris, and that we're sort of programmed by our genes to give ourselves credit and see ourselves in particularly good or even heroic light, which I think if you get down to brass tacks, maybe you'd have to say, well, look, being caring has worked well for us. Understanding that causing harm to others is wrong. On the other hand, we have as long in our history as you care to go, we have waged war on the other group, typically the other religion, but however we want to define it, it has been an us versus them. They are unworthy, and we're still doing it in I don't know how many countries right now.
Right. Well, I agree with you by and large, Buck. I think that ethics, if you distinguish ethical philosophy from the practical ethics you're talking about, the real ethics that everyday people have, those ethics do, they do evolve out of us trying to get along with our neighbors and fight off our enemies. And so it's perfectly all right to shoot somebody if they're one of them, and completely horrifyingly wrong if they're one of us. And ultimately, though, we're asking robots to become much better ethicists than we are, and really take into account consequences to everyone, not just to ourselves. But the reality is that we're developing robots that kill. Do you think we're going to have robot wars? If I know you're going to develop an AGI that's going to potentially kill me, I'm going to develop one that could potentially stop it, wouldn't I?
I guess it would, depending on your definition of robot, I would say we're already having that. Like, is an automated defense system that can calculate a trajectory of something and then fire a weapon to intercept something automatically, is that, does that count?
I'm not sure it does. I mean, it's still kind of an automatic system, but it behaves as we designed it to, at least if we designed it right.
Yeah, to me, it comes down to where do you draw the lines in terms of the language you use, and what counts as intelligent behavior, what doesn't. Is calculating. One thing that we evolved to do is we and other. Well, a lot of other mammals or a lot of other animals with a nervous system and a brain, is we develop this sense of persistence. So if the rabbit goes behind the boulder, or a rock or a bush or something, we and the wolf and lots of other creatures, we have a sense of persistence that even though that we don't see that rabbit anymore, we still believe it's there. And then what we do is, if we happen to be hunting the rabbit, we make a heuristic guess based on, well, which way do we think this rabbit might dash based on what we've seen rabbits do in the past. Now, is that imagination? Imagination being the traditional or one of the traditional criteria for intelligence. I'm not sure. It gets into what for me is a very gray area, and I'm sure there are people who have really teased out all the details on this. But I think you could argue it either way. You could say, well, look, you can just run a very simple statistical analysis of rabbits, but our neurons tend to do that biologically and completely unconsciously.
Yeah, I think
we don't know.
Yeah,
we don't know what when we're reacting. We have no sense of even how we're moving our leg muscles to chase the rabbit, much less how we decide to point our sharp stick.
Right. Well, I mean, even narrow AI has to have some object permanence, right? I mean, a self-driving car, for example, would need.
It has to have object permanence.
Yeah, I mean, it has to see something disappear behind a bridge. It needs to know it's going to come out the other side. Yeah, they have to solve all those problems for self-driving cars. There's a lot of very tricky problems they have to solve, but they're all in a pretty narrow domain.
That's I hadn't thought about that. I don't know that that's true, but if it is, that would be very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, even military tracking systems have to track something that has temporarily disappeared from the sensors. But
no, I have seen that.
I've had to mute my mic here. Hold on a second. Sorry about that. There are a lot of aspects of human intelligence that it's very difficult to imagine how they would be implemented. But we know that biology, without even any kind of design smarts at all, made it happen. So, we do know that AGI is possible. The question is, are we going to be able to make it happen in a substrate other than a biological brain? And the answer may be it's a lot harder than we think.
Well, what about Watson?
Watson is a very good narrow AI example. Watson is really good at searching through enormous databases and doing some natural language understanding.
Mm-hmm.
But only with enormous effort. There's a very large team of programmers behind Watson.
Well, I would say we have a very large team behind us. It's different, but I think there's a lot of similarities there, and it sure seems smart. Mm-hmm. But even the designers, it's a case where even the designers can't tell you why it came up with the answer it did.
Right. Well, any system sufficiently complex will reach that point. You can even design a fairly simple neural network and not know exactly how it matches the pattern. But the whole question of is AGI even possible, I think is a legitimate question. Because as some people pointed out, even though our technology is improving exponentially, the problems are exponentially hard. And
how would you know if you had it?
Well, that's also a good question. There's the Turing test. There's some people don't.
Coffee test.
Turing test is kind of out of fashion these days, but I think it's pretty good.
Yeah, there's the coffee test as well, which is a robot is given the task of going into your house. I build a robot and I send it to your house. I've never been there, and the task is to make a cup of coffee. Find the kettle, find your cupboards, find your kitchen, and make a nice cup of coffee.
That's an excellent test.
I was looking at that on Wikipedia.
I'm not sure I could do that. Where's the damn kettle in here?
A cup of coffee is hard.
Here's a test. I just moved. I just moved house. So go through my boxes and find what I'm looking for. Yeah. I think it's a sort of thing that it's like pornography. You'll know it when you see it, but you can't define it very well. There's no bright line really. It'll just someday your robot will ask you a question that strikes you as remarkably intelligent and perceptive, and you'll be conversing with it as if for a human, and you realize that you've reached that point.
Well, I guess it would depend on how it responded to the answer. If I was able to give a meaningful answer and it progressed, then I would say that it had surpassed your typical creationist.
Well, I'm not sure that's a big challenge, but would it know what it doesn't know? Would it? Well, I mean, Siri will tell you, right? When she doesn't know something. It's humans have a lot of we have a lot of bugs in our intelligence. There's a Dunning-Kruger effect, for example, where people who aren't good at something don't realize it. There's even very intelligent people have blind spots and biases, and
mathematicians are the worst.
And
I think it's because their level of expertise. There was a magician who said he would much rather perform in front of a room of PhDs than in front of an audience of farmers.
Yeah,
because the PhDs are the farmers take the view that they're not experts, and that they are capable of being easily fooled, and this makes them much more cautious.
Farmers are also pretty hard to convince. And PhDs think they already know what's going on, so yeah. Well, that was the point of Project Alpha. I don't know if you ever heard of that, but it's a program. I think this happened in the 1970s. James Randi recruited a couple of very talented young magicians, and they fooled PhD scientists into believing that they had psychic powers. And James Randi later came out and said it's much easier to fool PhD scientists than it is to fool the average person, because they don't think they could be wrong. And
well, I've experienced this in terms of I've talked with physicists about things and said, well, don't you think this is odd? And, does this really seem like it could plausibly be a real effect? And the response that I got from this guy who was top of his field, I don't want to say his name, but he said, well, we know it's real because we've measured it very, very accurately. And I said, well, the motion of the sun can be measured to an arbitrary number of decimal places, and you can measure the motion of the sun around the Earth very, very closely. But we don't believe that the sun moves around the Earth. We believe that that's an illusion. So what would you say to the person who was in a geocentric paradigm who says, look, we know the motion of the sun is real because we measured it? How would you address that person? And he just stared at me, and kind of with a smile, like, oh, you naive youngster. But he had no answer. And I looked at him and I watched him smiling at me. And I thought, well, this doesn't strike me as a particularly profound question. But it was a real, apparently it was, it left him nonplussed, let's put it that way.
Well, if you had to explain to, say, go back in time, explain to a Mayan astronomer why his assumptions were wrong, you would not be able to persuade him. He says, my calendar has got it nailed. I've got a perfect system here. I can predict where the sun and the moon and stars will be. You'd have to bring him forward into the 20th, at least the 19th century, to show him the imperfections in his system. So,
well, I think they had, rather than a geometric system, I think they had a numerical system, didn't they?
Yeah, they did.
Okay.
And
well,
but it was very, they were quite good at it.
Yeah, I mean, for what it is, it was a perfectly adequate system, but in my opinion. But my view tends to be more toward pragmatism. Like, is it good? My view on science is that it's a tool, and that's sort of the view I take with artificial intelligence as well. It's a tool for doing something. And for me, the question is, does it do a good job of what we need it to do? I may not like that this particular artificial intelligence is used to blow people up. I may not like that this sophisticated collection of resources and manpower is going into beating people at Jeopardy. But the question is, does it do a good job? And if it does, then I say, well, that's okay. The Mayan system, they wanted to be able to predict the positions in the heavens of Venus and eclipses and whatever. And they did a job for the observations that they had. So in that case, I would say, great, more power to you. And as long as you don't have what in Thomas Kuhn's terms we call anomalies, as long as you don't have anomalies that are persistent and troublesome, then you're good.
Right.
So, like, we could have gone to the moon and back just with Newton. We didn't need relativity for that.
Right. Well, I mean, even in Copernicus's time, right, the Ptolemaic system was producing predictions that were as good as Copernicus could produce, but the problem was that
better in many ways.
But the problem was that their system had to get more complicated every time a new observation came in. It just collapsed under its own weight eventually, whereas the Copernican system did not have that problem. So
you know about the Copernican system being the Copernican proposal being falsified.
No, I don't know about that.
Yeah, well, because there was this debate going on, and the Ptolemaics said, okay, you Copernicans, if your theory, if your hypothesis is correct, then the Earth is moving gigantic, many, many millions and millions of miles as it goes around the sun. You've got a problem, because if that happens, then what we're going to see is the positions of the stars change relative to each other. There's going to be a change of parallax that we will be able to see. And so the Copernicans who were defending this position said, you're right, and we will. Let's measure it. So they did. They measured this, and they found no change at all. So the theory had been falsified. Did the Copernicans give up their theory? No. What they did was they moved the goalposts. And they said, no, the problem isn't that the Earth is really the center. The problem is that the stars are so far away that we can't detect any motion. Well, this was if anybody did that today, we might be tempted to say that's agreed to a test that would indicate whether or not, this is the Popperian virtue of is something falsifiable. Karl Popper said, that the test of whether an idea is scientific is whether you can falsify it. Can you do something that will show you that it isn't true? They did that, and it showed that their theory wasn't true, and they had agreed to this. Well, then they decided that when the experiment didn't come out their way and the measurement didn't support them, then they shifted somewhere else. And so the idea survived, and it has been argued that this type of move is a demonstration that sometimes it's good for us to be very irrational.
Well, but let's talk about a term that pops up a lot in these kinds of discussions, which is the singularity. Can we get robots that are so smart that they design better robots? And that at that point, it's a runaway system. Humans are not in control. There's a lot of ways that could happen, right? It could be some kind of AGI. It could be what Robin Hanson calls M's, which are, emulations of human intelligence, but they run a lot faster, and they don't get tired, and you can make many copies of them. Hanson's concept is the M's we would pick, the 1% or so of human who are the most highly productive, and we would make lots of copies of them. And they would run many, many times faster than a human brain. And we'd all be sitting here with nothing to do. Now, the singularity concept of Kurzweil is a bit different. He envisions humans merging with the technology and sort of going along for the ride, as you will, especially if humans that are prepared for that. What do you guys think of the singularity of the concept? Is it the right metaphor, or does it need some adjustment, or is it perhaps just way out of whack with reality?
Well, I would probably go along with the idea of augmenting humans choosing, maybe not all humans, definitely not all humans, but some humans choosing to augment themselves with machine parts, whether that's body parts, exoskeletons, prosthetics, additional sensory inputs, which we can begin to understand how that.
I'm augmented now, right? I have glasses. I have technology that augments me, right? I mean,
but would it be?
That's something.
And also, we would probably go along with augmenting their mental capacity, their brain function. I'm sure some people use drugs to enhance, or allegedly to enhance, their mental faculties already. So I think there's definite evidence to suggest that some people will choose to augment themselves.
Now, is that a false promise? I mean, for example, the smart drugs have not been. I don't think anybody's really persuaded me that the smart drugs are
certainly wouldn't be rushing
making you all that smart.
No.
I was disappointed when I looked into them that there really wasn't that much science behind any of it.
What kind of smart drugs? This is new to me.
Well, various supplements and drugs that some people claim enhance cognitive functioning. However, I've not found solid scientific support for any of that.
Well, there is what is it? It's I don't know if it's LSD or if it's marijuana, or there's a structure in your brain that is responsible for giving us a sense of individuality and separateness. And the pathways that utilize this or that connect to this structure can be impacted by drugs. So that when people have this in their bloodstream, whatever affects these pathways, they get a sense of oneness with reality, with everything. So this is a new sensation. It's a new perception that is, I would say, that sort of expands your sense. I'm starting to think that I would have to Google this, but that sounds like the reports that I've heard of LSD experiences. But
right.
I would want to check.
Or DMT, perhaps. Yeah.
DMT.
Right. I'm not sure that we're talking about enhanced cognitive functioning, though. I'm like, how many lines of code can I write in a day based upon what I'm ingesting?
That sounds more like productivity.
Yeah. Well, productivity, or just being able to think fast and remember well.
Okay.
Reason accurately without making mistakes.
Well, I heard amphetamines were very good for that. That if you took amphetamines, it would decrease the permeability of your nerves, and you would learn things faster, and your brain would process faster.
I'm not sure that's been studied properly, probably because of the illegal nature of the street drugs. But of course, you can get amphetamines on prescription. But
well, as I recall, I heard that from a guy who was a professor of some kind of psychology.
I'll tell you what. Let's take the action to follow up on that and figure out what's really known about that. Before we venture too much off into our to the swamp of ignorance there. So there's really kind of a couple of maybe we should sort of branch off and do another show on this, but there's a couple of possibilities. There's the notion that we're going to get a hard takeoff and AI is just going to leave us in the dust and to our own resources. And the other is we'll get a soft takeoff and humanity gets a chance to kind of adjust and evolve. But in both cases, we get intelligences that are far more advanced than human, that are improving themselves and don't really need us to do much for them. That Hanson's M's are very similar, that they have their own economy. They have their own value system, their own money, everything. And they move so much faster than we do that we can't possibly hope to keep up with them. Now, the interesting thing Robin Hanson told me was that we see these revolutions every once in a while. We see the agricultural revolution, which led to a much faster doubling of the human economy. And then the Industrial Revolution, which was much, much faster. And now, with the Information Revolution, we're doubling the size of the economy about every 15 years. He envisions we'll get it to a point where we're doubling the size of the economy every few months, maybe even every few weeks. And at that point, based upon history, you only get so many doublings before you get another revolution. And then something else happens that nobody can tell you what it will be. I mean, nobody could have predicted the agricultural revolution and what would happen after that. Nobody could have predicted the industrial revolution and what would happen after that. And so we're, in a sense, that is each of these was a singularity in the Kurzweil sense that we can't see past it, and we may not be able to see past the next singularity or the one after that, but the one after that will take place within a few years of the first one, because of the very rapid growth that we'll see, and so. What does that? Where does that leave humans? Are we going to be able to survive? Well, these machines would have very little incentive to hurt us or harm us, at least that we can foresee. They might even be incentivized somewhat to keep us as pets, or treat us with kindness just out of out of pity. I don't know.
Oh, I hope not.
They might think we're adorable.
They would definitely need for that to happen. They would definitely need their own sense of for this expansion to occur. They would definitely need to have an imperative that we have to reproduce and continue their existence through time, which we come pre-programmed with.
Right, but I mean, wouldn't natural selection take care of that? The ones that don't have that would very quickly cease to be.
Or they'd be pushed out by the ones that do have the capacity to replicate themselves.
Or the drive to replicate themselves. I mean, every one of us is descended from a very long line of organisms that had a drive to replicate themselves, whether they knew it or not. And I
think the advantage would be that the machines didn't have a long history of that.
Mm-hmm. Now,
in our case, with our advanced technology, this is somewhat of a problem. When nature was, hemming us in before we developed technology and whatnot, we weren't really in a position to undermine our own the environment to a sufficient point where it would prove disastrous. Populace, for example, that plagues would rip through the population and pretty much annihilate everyone who had grown dependent on actually a large society being around. Now that's the case. I mean, if society collapsed now, there would be very few humans left around. There's probably some people out in the Amazon who would be unaffected and a few others here and there. But assuming it wasn't a climatic disaster that caused it.
Yeah, well, I mean, after the agricultural revolution, there were still hunter-gatherers, right? After the industrial revolution, there were still agrarian people, and so there's always some that stay with the old ways, and so after each revolution, and now so far we don't have an example of them ever coming back and taking over again. Because they're simply not driven to do that. They don't want the world we've made.
Amish power.
They may be. You may argue that they're just as happy as we are, but they're not going to take over the world, right? They have a lot of children, but still, those children, a lot of them leave the faith. But with the singularity, a lot of us could potentially be left without jobs, or even if you don't think the singularity is a good metaphor or a good framing of what might happen, will we be okay? Will we Will we make it through somehow? Us biological beings, or our children, or our grandchildren?
Well, there's one thing I'm not sure I quite understand, and it may well be that I missed a point somewhere here. I can see where certain jobs will disappear, probably to a large extent. You mentioned car driving at the beginning. Automatic vehicles and so on that could remove occupations such as taxi driving and so on.
Sure.
And obviously with online education, then to some extent, teaching is already conducted by automated systems. But there'll always be space for some teachers, hopefully, like me. But what I don't quite get is, well, if you wanted to have an industry or a collection of industries which were using robots to sell services to humans, and none of the humans are, if we take it to the extreme, none of the humans are working or in employment. They have no capacity to earn money or to purchase these services, and therefore the services will not be provided. And you have, in my naive understanding of economics, which is pretty much zero, you don't have any economics.
Well, I think that's
missing.
I think that's a very good point, Chris. The robots would have to develop their own economy amongst themselves.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, because
I can't see how there would be any other economy.
Yeah, if we humans are using only if our needs for housing and food and so forth are 0.1% of the gross product, where's the other product going to? Right, it's going to robot exchange. That it's a difficult concept. I admit it. It's hard to think of machines as being consumers, but
you must have a very different electricity bill than I do.
Well, no, probably not. In fact, mine's pretty high. But looking down the road here, my electricity is probably mostly generated with coal and natural gas. I don't think that's going to last that much longer. But in terms of
very unlikely,
the amount of free energy that's available on the planet, it's a tiny, what we're currently consuming is a tiny fraction of it. So, but at the point of the singularity, if you accept that paradigm, you've got AIs that make their own purposes, make their own world, if you will. So,
well, everything starts from somewhere. I mean, they're not going to be, and if the singularity does occur as envisioned, and I'm sure there's a huge spectrum of that vision, but the fact remains that evolution, the core requirements of evolution need to be built into the system to get it started. And those core requirements are replication, variation among replicas, and selection for particular variations. And if you have those three things, over the course of time, you get the kind of evolution that we're talking about.
Yeah, and I can see where all that would come from. Yeah. I mean, replication's easy. You just make more, right? Manufacturing.
Yes, but
it's
kind of like 3D printers. You need 3D printers that can produce other 3D printers.
Yeah.
So, and that's kind of the first thing that you want to be able to build. This was a discussion that was presented with regard to establishing a base on the moon. And this was my argument, was that you want a 3D printer to be able to produce an exact copy of itself, followed very quickly by its ability to produce a repair, kind of a repair robot, so that it could repair either of the replicas. And if you can do that, and then you can manufacture all the parts and then repair all the parts, you've got then a foundation to proceed. But until you've got that basis, kind of, you don't. And that's somewhat analogous, I'm guessing, to how life got started.
Okay. Well, that's a good point. I've often challenged the notion of von Neumann machines based on the fact that a machine that can replicate itself is a far more complex machine than a machine that cannot. That I don't think we humans have ever built a standalone self-replicating machine. We can build machines that we can make copies of easily enough, but we have to have a large system of infrastructure behind it.
Well, but don't you think that those are two separate categories, complexity versus the ability of replication?
Well, no, I mean
I agree that self-replication is complex.
Yeah.
But I can very easily see something that is more complex that is not interested in self-replicating.
Well, I can imagine. I can imagine that. I just don't know what its purpose would be. So anyway, we're going to wrap up now pretty soon. And Chris, is there one last thing you'd like to say or add in?
Well, maybe, just before I head off, the idea of the singularity resulting in a large number of robots evolving on their own would bring in the question of resource exhaustion at some point, and it's somewhat in conflict with discussions that people have about sustainable development and sustainable extraction of resources. It's just something that would actually put a brake on how fast these things can happen. I think you perhaps mentioned the second singularity would happen within a few years of the first one. It might not if resource exhaustion is a limiting factor, and exponential growth can't be sustained indefinitely. It just can't be unless we move off the planet, but even then it becomes the problem reappears quite rapidly that you again reach resource exhaustion even with an entire solar system at your disposal. I just wonder what people think about how.
I think you're right. Exponential growth can't go on very long, or you're larger than the universe. There has to be a limit somewhere. Yeah, and it may be that machines would not care about destroying the planet that we humans need to survive on. Yeah.
Well, or on the other hand, they might actually make a better job of it. If they're supposed to be more intelligent than us at some point, then it might occur to them more readily that actually unlimited growth, or even growth is really not something that you can always have. We can't, even if we don't have any robots, even if it's just us humans existing, I don't see how we can have growth forever.
Right. Buck, any final thoughts?
Well, I really like that point that regarding the unbridled drive for replication. I think that's the key. I think that would be almost, I would call it the key virtue to build into a system like this, would be to provide attention to what is now a hot button. And so I'm probably being overly influenced by this, but sustainability. And for promoting human flourishing, which I don't think is necessarily produced anymore by having the maximum number of people. When we evolved, this was the case. But now we have, we as a species have moved beyond a place where we are competing for survival. We are the undisputed champion dominant species of our planet, to the point where we are now risking our own survival. There's an existential risk for humanity long term. And I think that building in our best, most cautious and most empathetic, having empathy, having those kind of heuristics that minimize suffering and support flourishing in maximum diversity, with a balance against minimizing suffering. I think that's a great area to focus our attention.
Okay, well, thanks,
Chris. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a good basis.
You expanded my horizons, and I absolutely love that.
Okay, well, thanks a lot.
No, but I think that's a good story as well. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks, Chris and Buck, and I'd like to thank both of you for showing up. I know Chris had to stay up awfully late. He's 5 hours ahead of us, and he's 5 hours ahead of me. Buck's in even a different time zone. So this has been episode 3 of the Unseen Podcast. Go to unseenpodcast.com for more information or learn how you can become part of the panel pool. And we'll see you 1 week from today, where we will have what we plan to have, and I think she'll show up this time, Hiraja Shaib, and we're going to have a discussion about the future economy, peer-to-peer, cooperative, and how cryptocurrency plays into that, Bitcoin, Dogecoin, and the rest of that very complex milieu that's evolving in front of our eyes. So I'm looking forward to that. I'll see you in 1 week. And until then, this has been Paul Carr, your host, and this is the Unseen Podcast.
Okay. I'm guessing we're done.